now let's go ahead and interpret this risk ratio of 2. So first of all, we already addressed this first question here when it comes to interpretation, which is, do I want a lower event rate or a higher event rate? So in this case, we do want a higher event rate. Now we want to be able to understand what each of these risk ratios would mean in this specific situation with this specific PICO question. So what does an RR of less than 1 mean? What does an RR of equal to 1 mean? And what does an RR of greater than 1 mean? So let's start with RR greater than 1, since our risk ratio is greater than 1, and we did get an RR of 2. So let's go ahead and start there. So let's think back to our equation, which is RR equals EER over CER. So when your RR is greater than 1, that means that your experimental event rate is greater than your control event rate. And that is true always, because this is just going off of your formula. If your RR is a number that is greater than 1, then that would mean that your numerator is a bigger number compared to the denominator, or the control event rate. So with an RR of greater than 1, that would mean that more patients in the experimental group are experiencing the event compared to patients in the control group. So in this situation, we said that our event is a good thing and that we want a higher event rate. So we want our risk ratio to be greater than 1 in this specific situation. And we got a risk ratio of 2. So how would I interpret this? I would say that patients in the liraglutide group are 2 times more likely to lose at least 5% of their body weight. So the 2 times comes from the risk ratio being 2. Now let's just think of these other situations which don't apply to our risk ratio, because our risk ratio was greater than 1. But let's say our risk ratio was equal to 1. So that would mean that our CER equals our EER. And so for example, let's say that 6 patients in the liraglutide group and 6 patients in the comparison group achieve that 5% reduction in their body weight. So that would mean that your control event rate is equal to experimental event rate, and there is the same proportion of patients in the experimental group and the comparison group, the control group, that are experiencing the event of interest. And so this is what we call our point of no difference. So if we got a risk ratio of 1, then that would mean that our event rate is exactly the same in both groups. Now, what if your risk ratio was less than 1? Well, that goes back to our formula. RR equals EER minus CER. So if your risk ratio is less than 1, then that would mean that your risk ratio was less than 1, then that would mean that your denominator, your CER, is a bigger number when compared to your experimental event rate, or your numerator. So again, if the risk ratio is less than 1, just by thinking of simple math, that would mean that your control event rate is a bigger number compared to your experimental event rate. So here, with your CER being greater than your EER, that would mean in this situation that patients in the control group, or in the no liraglutide group, actually were more likely to achieve at least a 5% reduction in their body weight compared to patients in the experimental group or the liraglutide group. So as you can see, if we had gotten a risk ratio of less than 1, then that would actually be the exact opposite of what we expect from this trial.